The spring morning of May 17, 1943, dawned cold and gray over Bassingbourn, England. Captain Robert Morgan stood on the tarmac at 0600 hours, his breath forming small clouds in the pre-dawn chill. He'd barely slept. None of them had. The weight of what this day meant pressed down on every man in the crew, like the heavy flak jackets they wore on missions. Morgan was 24 years old, though the lines around his eyes made him look older. He came from Asheville, North Carolina, and had named his plane after his sweetheart, Margaret Polk of Memphis, Tennessee. Her face, painted by crew chief Joe Giambrone in the style of George Petty's pin-up girls, adorned the nose of their B-17. Over the past 8 months, that painted face had become the most famous image in the 8th Air Force. The crew arrived one by one, their footsteps echoing across the hardstand. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this 24 times before. But today was different. Today was their 25th mission, the magic number that would send them home, if they made it back. The odds were not in their favor. Statistically, a bomber crew had only a 1 in 4 chance of surviving a full tour of duty. Morgan knew the numbers intimately. He'd watched too many friends spiral down in flames, seen too many empty bunks in the barracks. The 8th Air Force was bleeding crews at an unsustainable rate, losing nearly half its aircraft on some missions. Co-pilot Captain Jim Varinis approached with a thermos of coffee, his face drawn and pale. Varinis was from Connecticut, a former engineer who'd learned to fly with the precision of a man who understood mathematics and probability. "Target's Bremen," he said quietly, handing Morgan a chipped ceramic cup. "The U-boat pens. Deep penetration." Morgan took a long sip of the bitter coffee, letting the heat spread through his chest. Bremen. That meant flying 300 miles into Germany, through the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. It meant fighters, lots of them, and heavy flak from gun batteries that had been practicing their deadly craft for years. The submarine pens at Bremen were crucial to the German war effort in the Atlantic, and Hitler's forces would defend them with everything they had. "Weather?" Morgan asked. "Clearing over the target. Visibility good." Varinis paused. "Too good, maybe." They stood in silence, watching the ground crews swarm over the Memphis Belle, checking every system, loading ammunition belts, fueling the 4 Wright Cyclone engines that would have to carry them there and back. The armorers wheeled up the bombs, 12 500-pounders, 4,000 pounds of high explosive that would drop on the U-boat construction facilities. The rest of the crew assembled near the plane. There was navigator Captain Chuck Layton, a quiet man from Michigan who could plot a course through the worst weather with uncanny accuracy. Bombardier Captain Vince Evans from North Dakota, whose steady hand on the Norden bomb site had put their loads on target mission after mission. Flight engineer Staff Sergeant Harold Locke, who knew every rivet and wire of the B-17 and could coax performance from damaged systems that seemed impossible. Radio operator Staff Sergeant Robert Hansen from Spokane, Washington, whose calm voice had guided them through radio blackouts and jamming. The gunners, Sergeant Cecil Scott in the ball turret, a kid from New Jersey small enough to fit in that cramped sphere of death beneath the plane. Sergeant Casimir Nastel at the right waist gun, a tough kid from Detroit. Sergeant Clarence Winchell on the left waist gun, always cracking jokes to break the tension. And Sergeant John Quinlan in the tail turret, the loneliest position on the plane, watching their 6 o'clock through hundreds of miles of hostile sky. They'd flown together so long they could read each other's thoughts. They'd been to Wilhelmshaven, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and back. They'd been to the Focke-Wulf plant at Bremen twice before, They'd watched the 91st Bomb Group lose plane after plane, including the original lead crew that was supposed to be first to finish 25 missions. The Memphis Belle crew had inherited that destiny through survival and skill. At 06:45, they gathered for the briefing in the Nissen hut that served as operations. The room smelled of cigarette smoke, sweat, and fear. 200 men packed the benches: pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners. When the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain covering the mission map, a collective groan rippled through the room. The red yarn stretched deep into Germany, all the way to Bremen. "Gentlemen," the intelligence officer began, a major whose name Morgan could never remember. "Your target today is the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory and U-boat construction pens at Bremen. This is a maximum effort mission. Fighter escort will take you to the German border. Then you're on your own until the return leg." That was the worst part. The gap. Allied fighters didn't have the range to escort the bombers all the way to deep targets and back. There was a window, sometimes an hour or more, where the B-17s were alone in the sky with only their own guns for protection. That's when the Luftwaffe hit hardest. The major continued, pointing out flak concentrations, fighter bases, expected resistance. Morgan stopped listening to the details. He'd heard it all before. Instead, he studied the route, memorizing landmarks, calculating fuel consumption and timing. Leighton would navigate, but Morgan wanted to know the way himself. If Leighton went down, Morgan would have to get them home. Weather briefing followed. Then the chaplain said a prayer. Morgan wasn't particularly religious, but he bowed his head with the others. If God was listening, they could use all the help they could get. At 07:30 hours, the crews walked to their planes. Some men were quiet, lost in private thoughts. Others joked and laughed too loudly. Morgan saw one pilot, a kid on his third mission, vomiting behind a truck. Nobody mentioned it. They'd all been there. The Memphis Belle sat on her hardstand, engines already warming up. Chief Giambrone gave Morgan a thumbs up. "She's ready, Captain," purring like a kitten. Morgan ran his hand along the cold aluminum fuselage, feeling the patches where holes had been repaired, the scars of flak and fighter attacks. This plane had brought them back every time. She'd taken punishment that would have killed other bombers, and she'd kept flying. He silently promised her this would be the last time, that after today she could rest. The crew climbed aboard through the small hatch behind the ball turret. Inside, the B-17 smelled of oil, hydraulic fluid, and the peculiar metallic scent of military equipment. Each man moved to his station with practiced efficiency. Morgan and Verinis settled into the cockpit, running through the pre-flight checklist. Gauges, controls, trim tabs, fuel mixture, everything had to be perfect. At 07:58, the first B-17 in the formation began its takeoff roll. Every 30 seconds, another followed. The roar of dozens of Wright Cyclone engines shook the earth. Morgan watched the planes ahead lift off, heavy with fuel and bombs, struggling into the sky. One B-17 had an engine failure on takeoff and aborted, limping back to the hardstand. That cruise war was over for today. "Memphis Belle, you're cleared for takeoff," came the tower's voice in Morgan's headset. "Roger that." Morgan advanced the throttles. The B-17 lurched forward, slowly at first, then faster. The end of the runway approached. At 110 miles per hour, Morgan pulled back on the yoke. The Memphis Belle lifted off, gear retracting with a thump. They were airborne. The bombers climbed through thick cloud layers, circling the field to gain altitude and form up. Finding your place in the formation was an art, especially in clouds. Morgan watched for the assembly ship, a war-weary B-17 painted in garish colors that served as a visual reference point. Gradually, the formation took shape. 36 B-17s arranged in combat boxes, each positioned to provide mutual defensive fire. The Memphis Belle flew in the lead group, the most dangerous and most prestigious position. They climbed to 27,000 feet, where the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The crew plugged in their electrically heated suits, but the cold still seeped in, numbing fingers and toes. At this altitude, the air was so thin that a man without oxygen would lose consciousness in minutes. They all wore oxygen masks, the rubber pressing uncomfortably against their faces for hours on end. The English Channel passed beneath them, gray and endless, whitecaps visible far below. Then the coast of Holland appeared, a thin brown line separating sea from land. This was enemy territory now. Every person below them, every soldier, every gun, every fighter pilot, wanted them dead. The first flak appeared over the coast, black puffs of smoke blooming in the sky like deadly flowers. The gunners on the ground were getting their range, walking their fire toward the formation. A burst exploded close to the Memphis Belle, close enough that Morgan heard the shrapnel patter against the fuselage. The plane shuddered, but kept flying. "Fighter escorts leaving," Verinis called out, watching the P-47 Thunderbolts peel away. The American fighters had reached the limit of their range. From here on, the bombers were on their own. The Luftwaffe didn't keep them waiting long. Over the Zuider Zee, the German fighters came. First a few, then more, then what seemed like swarms of them. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, their yellow noses bright against the sky. They attacked in pairs, diving through the bomber formation from every angle, their wing cannons and machine guns flashing. "Fighters, 12 o'clock high!" Leighton called from the nose. The Memphis Belle's guns opened up. The roar was deafening even through the sheepskin helmets and leather earphones. The 50 caliber machine guns hammered away, spent shell casings clattering to the floor. The smell of cordite filled the plane, acrid and choking. A B-17 on their left took a direct hit to the cockpit. Morgan watched in horror as the plane fell away, its nose shattered, beginning a long spiral toward the earth. Parachutes blossomed. 1, 2, 3. Not enough. Not nearly enough. "Fighters at 6 o'clock!" Quinlan yelled from the tail turret. 2 Focke-Wulfs came in low, their 20mm cannons tearing through the formation. One B-17 exploded in a ball of orange flame, disintegrating so quickly that there was no time for anyone to bail out. 10 men gone in an instant, vaporized before they could even scream. In the ball turret, suspended beneath the plane in his transparent bubble, Scott tracked fighters with his twin 50s, firing controlled bursts. A Messerschmitt made a pass, and Scott's rounds stitched across its wing. The German fighter rolled away, trailing smoke, but Scott didn't watch. Another fighter was already coming in. The battle raged for 30 minutes, though it felt like hours. Fighters dove, bombers fired back, planes fell from the sky on both sides. The air was full of tracer rounds, green from the German guns, red from the American. Parachutes drifted down like dandelion seeds. Some were German pilots, some were American airmen, all of them falling toward an uncertain fate. A Focke-Wulf made a head-on pass, coming straight at the Memphis Belle's nose. Evans in the bombardier position fired the nose gun, his rounds converging with the Germans. For a moment, it looked like a deadly game of chicken. At the last second, the Focke-Wulf broke away, one engine streaming black smoke. Then, As suddenly as it had begun, the fighter attack broke off. The Luftwaffe pilots had expended their ammunition and fuel. They peeled away, heading back to their bases to rearm and refuel for another mission. But the bombers still had to reach Bremen, drop their bombs, and run the same gauntlet on the way home. Morgan checked his formation. They'd lost 4 bombers, 4 planes, 40 men. Some might have survived to become prisoners of war, but most were gone forever, their bodies scattered across the Dutch countryside. The gaps in the formation closed up as remaining planes moved to maintain the defensive box. Ahead, the target approached. Bremen lay beneath a clear sky, exactly as the weather officer had predicted. Unfortunately, that meant the German flak batteries had perfect visibility too. The flak over Bremen was the worst they'd ever encountered. The sky turned black with it, a solid wall of exploding shells. Each burst sent thousands of steel fragments tearing through the air at supersonic speeds. The German 88mm guns fired with mechanical precision, their crews having rehearsed this defense hundreds of times. Shrapnel tore through the Memphis Belle's aluminum skin like it was paper. Holes appeared in the wings, the fuselage, everywhere. A chunk of metal the size of a fist came through the cockpit windscreen, shattering the instrument panel and missing Morgan's head by inches. Wind roared through the opening, scattering maps and papers. "Jesus!" Varenus shouted, shielding his face from flying glass. Another bomber to their right simply disintegrated when a flak shell detonated inside its bomb bay. One moment it was there, the next, it was debris falling from the sky. Morgan forced himself not to think about the men who'd been in that plane just seconds ago. "Bomb bay doors open," Morgan said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. His job was to hold the plane straight and level no matter what. Evans needed a stable platform for his bomb sight to work. The bomb bay doors rumbled open, and suddenly the Memphis Belle was even more vulnerable, her belly exposed to the flak. Evans peered through his Norden bomb sight, making tiny adjustments. He'd been training for this moment for months. Everything came down to the next 30 seconds. The U-boat pens appeared in his crosshairs, concrete structures that looked like gray rectangles from 27,000 feet. Evans adjusted for wind, temperature, altitude, airspeed. The calculations were complex, but the Norden bomb sight was supposed to handle them automatically. Evans just had to keep the target centered. "Bombs away!" Evans called. The Memphis Belle lurched upward, suddenly 4,000 pounds lighter. Morgan felt the plane jump, responding more quickly to the controls. Behind them, the bombs fell in a long arc, whistling toward the target. 12 500-pound bombs from the Memphis Belle, joined by hundreds more from the rest of the formation. Morgan didn't wait to see the results. As soon as the bombs were away, he threw the plane into a hard turn, following the lead bomber. Getting away from the flak was the priority now. The explosions below were massive. The entire target area disappeared beneath columns of smoke and flame. Some bombs hit the U-boat pens, others hit nearby buildings. From up here, Morgan couldn't tell what damage they'd done, but he knew the intelligence officers would study reconnaissance photos later and assign them a score. But the fighters weren't done with them. As they cleared Bremen and turned for home, the Luftwaffe came back. These were fresh pilots from different bases, their planes fully armed and fueled. They dove through the formation with reckless aggression. 2 Messerschmitts came in from 11 o'clock high, a classic attack angle. Locke in the top turret swung his guns to meet them, firing burst after burst. Tracer rounds arced across the sky. One fighter veered off, but the other kept coming, guns blazing. Rounds punched through the Belle's left wing. Morgan felt the controls go sluggish. Fuel streamed from a damaged tank, leaving a vapor trail behind them. If a spark hit that fuel... "We're losing fuel from number 2 tank," Locke called over the intercom. "Switch to alternate tanks," Morgan ordered. "Reduce power to preserve fuel." The fighters pressed their attack. A Focke-Wulf came in from the rear, and Quinlan in the tail turret engaged it. The two warriors exchanged fire, machine gun against cannon. The Focke-Wulf's rounds tore through the tail section, and Quinlan grunted in pain. "Tail gunner hit," someone called. "How bad?" Morgan asked. "I'm okay," Quinlan gasped. "Shrapnel in my leg, still fighting." Another bomber went down, its left wing folding up after taking cannon fire. The plane spun like a falling leaf. Morgan counted parachutes. 5, 6, 7. 3 men hadn't made it out. The running battle continued across Holland. The Luftwaffe pilots were skilled and determined, but they were also running low on fuel and ammunition. Gradually, the attacks lessened. The fighters peeled away, heading home. The Channel appeared ahead, and Morgan felt a surge of relief so powerful it was almost painful. They'd made it this far. England was just minutes away now. But the Memphis Belle was in bad shape. One engine was running rough, coughing and sputtering. Hydraulic fluid streamed from damaged lines, coating the right wing in oily residue. The fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels, and Quinlan needed medical attention. "Bassingbourn, this is Memphis Belle," Morgan called on the radio. "Requesting priority landing. We have wounded aboard and damage to multiple systems." "Roger, Memphis Belle. You're cleared straight in. Ambulance will be standing by." The English coast appeared through the haze, green fields and hedgerows that looked like paradise after the hell of German airspace. Morgan began his descent, nursing the wounded bomber along. Every control input had to be gentle. The Belle was hanging together by luck and determination. Bassingbourn appeared, ahead. Morgan could see the runway, the control tower, the buildings that meant safety. But landing a damaged B-17 was dangerous. The hydraulic system was compromised, which meant the landing gear might not work properly. The brakes might fail, one wrong move, and they could cartwheel across the field. "Gear down," Morgan ordered. Verinis pulled the gear lever. They waited, listening for the thump of the wheels locking into place. One green light appeared on the panel, then another. The third stayed dark. "Right main gear shows unsafe," Verinis said. Morgan's mind raced through options. They could bail out and let the plane crash, but that seemed like a betrayal after she'd brought them this far. They could try a belly landing, but that could be catastrophic with a wounded man aboard. "We're going around," Morgan decided. "Recycle the gear." He added power to the sputtering engines and climbed away from the field. Verinis raised and lowered the landing gear again. This time, all 3 green lights illuminated. "Gear down and locked," Verinis confirmed. Morgan brought the Belle around for another approach. The field grew larger in the windscreen. Morgan could see people gathered to watch. Ground crews, off-duty personnel, even some of the brass. Word had spread that the Memphis Belle was coming home from her 25th mission. The runway threshold passed beneath them. Morgan pulled back the throttles and lifted the nose slightly. The wheels kissed the concrete with barely a jolt. It was one of his smoothest landings ever. The Belle rolled down the runway, and Morgan applied the brakes gently, praying they would work. The plane slowed, then stopped. They'd made it. 25 missions. They'd flown into hell and back, and they'd survived. Morgan sat in the cockpit for a moment, hands still on the controls, unable to quite believe it was over. Around him, the crew was silent. Then someone, Morgan thought it was Winchell, let out a whoop of joy. The spell broke, and suddenly everyone was laughing and crying and slapping each other on the back. Ground crews swarmed the plane. Ambulance crews rushed to help Quinlan, whose leg wound, while painful, wasn't life-threatening. Chief Giambrone walked around the Memphis Belle, shaking his head in amazement. He counted holes, over 100 of them. Some were tiny punctures from machine gun rounds. Others were ragged tears from flak fragments. One piece of shrapnel had passed through both sides of the fuselage without hitting anything vital. "She's a tough bird," Giambrone said, running his hand along the battered aluminum. "I'll have her patched up in no time." "No need," Morgan said quietly. "She's done her duty. She's going home." The news spread quickly. The Memphis Belle and her crew had completed their tour of duty. They would be returning to the United States for a war bond tour, helping raise money and morale. The plane would be retired from combat operations, preserved as a symbol of what American crews were accomplishing in the skies over Europe. That night, the crew celebrated in the officers' club, but Morgan found himself stepping outside, looking up at the stars. He thought about the men who hadn't made it back today, the men who wouldn't make it back tomorrow, the men who'd been lost on previous missions. The 91st Bomb Group had paid a terrible price for every bomb dropped on Germany. The Memphis Belle was famous now, but Morgan knew the real story wasn't about one plane or one crew. It was about all of them. The thousands of young men who climbed into their bombers every day, knowing the odds, flying anyway because the mission demanded it. Some would survive and tell their stories. Most would not. Morgan made a silent promise to remember them all, to never forget what they'd sacrificed in the skies over Europe. The war would grind on for 2 more years. The bombing campaign would intensify, the casualties would mount, and eventually the Allies would win. But the cost would be measured in blood and broken bodies, in boys who aged decades in months, in empty chairs at the morning briefing. The Memphis Belle had made her last flight over enemy territory. She had brought her crew home, mission after mission, through fighter attacks and flak and mechanical failures. She had earned her rest, and so had the 10 men who'd flown her. But for thousands of others, the war went on, and the bombers would fly again tomorrow. That was the real story of World War II in the air. Not the missions that made the headlines, but the grinding daily courage of ordinary men doing an extraordinary and terrible job. The Memphis Belle was just one plane, but she represented all of them, and Morgan was determined that her story would honor every crew that flew into the savage sky.